Vince Morrison had built his life the same way he built skyscrapers, with precision, patience, and an unshakable foundation. At 42, he owned Morrison Construction, a company that had risen from a single truck operation to one of the most respected builders in the state. His calloused hands and weathered face told the story of a man who had earned every dollar through sweat and determination. The Morrison name meant something in construction circles. When developers needed a job done right, they called Vince. When other contractors hit problems they couldn't solve, they sought his expertise. He had built his reputation on 3 principles: deliver on time, never cut corners, and honor your word. These weren't just business ethics. They were the code he lived by. His personal life reflected the same careful construction. Vince had met Claire Holbrook 15 years ago at a charity gala where his company was being honored for building a new children's hospital wing. She was 25 then, a radiant kindergarten teacher with honey blonde hair and eyes that seemed to light up when she smiled. Their courtship had been methodical, dinner dates that turned into weekend trips, which blossomed into a love that felt as solid as the foundations Vince poured. They married 3 years later in a ceremony that brought together 2 very different worlds. Vince's side was filled with rough-handed contractors, steel workers, and the kind of men who solved problems with action rather than words. Claire's side represented suburban comfort, teachers, insurance salesmen, and middle management types who had never gotten dirt under their fingernails. But love had bridged that gap, or so Vince had believed. Their home in Millbrook Heights was Vince's masterpiece, a custom-built colonial that showcased every skill he'd learned in 20 years of construction. Hand-selected hardwood floors, custom cabinetry he'd built himself, and a foundation that would outlast them both. Claire had decorated it with the warm touches that made it a home: family photos, soft lighting, and the scent of whatever candle matched her mood. For 12 years, their marriage had been Vince's greatest success. Claire seemed to understand his demanding schedule: the late nights when a project hit complications, the weekends spent on job sites when deadlines loomed. She never complained when he came home covered in dust and exhaustion, always greeting him with a kiss and asking about his day with genuine interest. But lately, something had shifted. Claire's questions about his work had become more pointed, more focused on his schedule and whereabouts. She'd started asking about specific job sites, wanting to know exactly when he'd be home. When he'd surprise Claire by coming home early, he'd sometimes catch a flicker of panic in her eyes before she'd smile and welcome him. The changes were subtle. New clothes she claimed were gifts from her teacher friends. Unexplained absences she attributed to faculty meetings or school events, and a phone that never left her side and was always face down on surfaces. Vince had noticed, but he built his life on trust. The foundation of their marriage was supposed to be as solid as the buildings he constructed. His crew had started to notice his distraction. Tommy Greco, his foreman and closest friend, had pulled him aside the previous week. "Boss, you've been somewhere else lately. Everything good at home?" Tommy had been with Morrison Construction since the beginning, a loyal Italian from the old neighborhood who'd rather take a beating than betray a friend. He read people the way Vince read blueprints, with an accuracy that came from years of experience. "Just tired, Tommy. This Riverside project is wearing me down." But Tommy's weathered face had shown he wasn't buying it. "Vince, we've been through wars together. I know when something's eating at you. You want to talk about it?" Vince had just shaken his head and walked away. He wasn't ready to voice the suspicions that were growing like cracks in a foundation. Not yet. The Riverside Commercial Complex was their biggest project to date, a $40 million development that would cement Morrison Construction's reputation as a major player. 3 buildings, including a 20-story office tower that would be the tallest structure outside the city center. It was the kind of project that attracted attention from competitors and required Vince's personal oversight on the most critical phases. As he stood on the 20th floor of the rising tower that morning, watching his crew position the final steel beam for the frame, Vince allowed himself a moment of pride. Below him, the city stretched out in a pattern of neighborhoods he'd helped shape, buildings that would stand long after he was gone. Testaments to the Morrison name and the standards he'd never compromised. His phone buzzed with a text from Claire. "Working late tonight. Faculty meeting about the new curriculum. Don't wait up. Love you." The same message, almost word for word, that she'd sent 3 times in the past 2 weeks. Vince stared at it, feeling something cold settle in his chest. Claire taught kindergarten at Millbrook Elementary, a small school where everyone knew everyone. How many curriculum meetings could they possibly need? He pocketed the phone and focused on the work. The crane operator was positioning the beam with surgical precision, guided by hand signals from Tommy 20 feet away. This was the work that made sense to Vince. Physical, honest, with results you could see and measure. "Looking good, boss," Tommy shouted over the wind. "Right on schedule." Vince nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He was thinking about trust, about foundations, and about what happened when you discovered the ground beneath you wasn't as solid as you believed. 3 weeks later, Vince stood in the emergency room of Millbrook General Hospital, his body a map of pain, and his mind struggling to process what Detective Ray Kowalski had just told him. The construction accident had left him with 2 broken ribs, a dislocated shoulder, and cuts that would heal. But the information about his wife might leave scars that would never fade. The accident itself had been a nightmare of steel and concrete. A crane cable had snapped during a lift on the 20th floor, sending a 3-ton steel beam crashing into the scaffolding where Vince had been inspecting weld joints. He'd had perhaps 2 seconds to recognize what was happening before the platform collapsed, trapping him under twisted metal and debris 40 feet above the ground. "Help me, please." He'd gasped into his phone when he managed to dig it from his pocket, his voice barely a whisper through the dust and pain. He'd called Claire first, the way a man calls for the person who means everything to him when he thinks he might die. The phone had rung once before she picked up. "Vince, what's wrong?" "Claire? I'm hurt bad. Construction accident. I'm trapped." The line had gone dead. Just like that. No questions, no panic, no promise to call for help or rush to the hospital. Just silence. It had taken the paramedics 45 minutes to extract him from the wreckage. 45 minutes of pain and confusion, wondering why his wife hadn't called back, why she hadn't immediately dialed 911, why the phone just rang and rang when he tried calling again. When he'd finally been wheeled into the emergency room, Claire was there. She was sobbing to Dr. Amanda Rodriguez, the attending physician, her performance worthy of an award. Mascara streaked down her cheeks, her hands shaking as she explained how devastated she was, how worried she'd been since getting the call from the hospital. But Vince had never given the hospital Claire's number, and he'd called her 45 minutes before the paramedics had even reached him. That's when Detective Kowalski had appeared. Ray was a veteran cop, the kind who'd seen enough lies to recognize truth when he heard it. He'd been following up on the accident report when he'd noticed some inconsistencies in the timeline. "Mr. Morrison, I need to speak with you privately." They'd moved to an empty consultation room, away from Claire's dramatic performance. Ray had closed the door and taken out a small notebook, his face grim. "Sir, we have security camera footage from the job site, and we've reconstructed the timeline of your accident. We also have phone records." He paused, studying Vince's reaction. "You called your wife at 2:47 p.m. The call lasted 18 seconds. Our witness, a worker on the ground who saw everything, confirms you were calling for help at that time." Vince's blood had run cold. "What witness?" "Joey Castellano. He was operating the crane when the cable snapped. He saw you fall, heard you calling out, and immediately called 911. That call was logged at 2:48 p.m. Ray had leaned forward. "Mr. Morrison, your wife didn't call the hospital until 3:35 p.m., nearly an hour after your accident, and she told them she'd just heard about it." The room had seemed to spin. That's not possible." "I'm afraid it is. We pulled your phone records with your permission when you were unconscious. Your wife answered your call, but she didn't call for help. She didn't call the hospital. She didn't call anyone." Ray's voice had grown harder. "She waited almost an hour, then called the hospital and asked if her husband, Vincent Morrison, had been brought in. When they confirmed you were there, she started her performance." But Ray wasn't finished. "Sir, we have a witness, and we need to talk about your wife. Joey saw something else. About 20 minutes before your accident, he spotted your wife's car in the parking lot of the Riverside Hotel. She wasn't alone. The Riverside Hotel, 3 blocks from the job site. Vince knew it well. It was where out-of-town contractors stayed when working on city projects. It was also where married people went when they didn't want to be seen." "Who was she with?" "A man we've identified as Derek Vaughn. Does that name mean anything to you?" Derek Vaughn. The name hit Vince like another falling beam. Derek was the architect on the Riverside project, a smooth-talking city boy who'd graduated from some Ivy League school and thought hard work was something other people did. He was 35, divorced, and had the kind of polished confidence that women seem to find attractive. Derek had been around the job site constantly, always finding reasons to need consultations about the design, always asking questions that could have been answered over email, always lingering just a little too long when Claire had visited the site during the early phases of construction. "I know him," Vince managed to say. "Mr. Morrison, I'm going to be direct with you. We think your wife knew you were hurt and chose not to help. We think she was with this Derek Vaughn when you called, and they decided to wait to see how things played out." The full implication crashed over Vince like a second wave of debris. They had waited to see if he would live or die. They had made a calculation. If Vince died in that accident, Claire would be a wealthy widow. The life insurance alone was worth $2 million. The business was worth another $8 million. The house, the investments, everything Vince had built through 20 years of backbreaking work. "There's more," Ray continued, his voice gentler. "Now, we've been monitoring some unusual activity related to your business accounts. Small things that might go unnoticed, unless you were looking for patterns. Someone with access to your files has been making inquiries about the company's value, your insurance policies, your will." Vince closed his eyes, feeling something fundamental break inside him. Not just his heart, but something deeper. Something that had to do with the man he'd believed himself to be and the world he'd thought he was living in. "How long has this been going on?" "We think at least 6 months, maybe longer. The hotel has security footage going back a year. We found 14 visits where your wife and Derek Vaughn were together. 14 times. 14 times his wife had betrayed their vows, their trust, their life together, not just for affection or loneliness, but for money, for the chance to start over without the husband who'd given her everything." When they'd returned to the emergency room, Vince had looked at Claire with new eyes. She was still crying, still playing the devastated wife for Dr. Rodriguez and the nurses. But now he could see the performance for what it was. The timing of her tears, the way she kept checking her phone, the relief in her eyes when she'd been told he would recover fully. She had been disappointed that he'd survived. That night, alone in his hospital bed while Claire went home to rest, Vince had stared at the ceiling and felt something cold and hard crystallizing in his chest. The man who had built his life on trust and honor was gone. The man who had believed in foundations and keeping your word had died in that accident as surely as if the beam had crushed him. What remained was someone else entirely. Someone who understood that when you build something, you also learn exactly how to tear it down. Someone who knew that the bigger they are, the harder they fall, and the more devastating the collapse when it comes. Claire and Derek thought they were playing a game. They had no idea they were about to face an opponent who built things to last, including his sense of retribution. 2 days after leaving the hospital, Vince sat in his home office, staring at architectural plans that suddenly felt like evidence of his own naivety. The custom-built colonial around him, every carefully chosen detail, every handcrafted element, now felt like a monument to his blind trust. But as he examined the blueprints spread across his desk, a different kind of plan began to take shape in his mind. The morning had brought an unexpected visitor. Tommy Greco had arrived with coffee and the kind of news that confirmed Vince's worst suspicions. "Boss, I didn't want to say nothing before, but after what happened..." Tommy settled his bulky frame into the chair across from Vince's desk, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. "That architect, Derek, he's been asking questions about you for months." "What kind of questions?" "Your schedule, your routines, when you'd be on site versus in the office. At first I figured it was just project coordination stuff, but then he started asking about your insurance, your business setup, whether you had partners who could take over if something happened to you." Tommy's dark eyes had hardened. "Boss, I've been in construction 30 years. Nobody asks those questions unless they're planning something." Vince had nodded, unsurprised, but grateful for the confirmation. "What else?" "Your wife's been calling the office when she knows you're not there, asking Monica about your schedule, about which sites you'll be visiting." Monica thought it was sweet, wife wanting to surprise you with lunch or whatever. Tommy had paused, his voice growing serious. "But she always asked real specific about the dangerous sites, the high-rise work, the crane operations." Monica Diarou was Morrison Construction's office manager, a sharp-eyed woman in her 50s who ran the administrative side with military precision. If Monica had noticed something off about Claire's calls, it was worth investigating. "I want to talk to Monica, and I want you to do something for me, Tommy. I need you to be my eyes and ears on every site. I want to know who's asking questions about what, who's been where they shouldn't be. Everything." Tommy had grinned, the expression transforming his scarred face. "You planning something, boss?" "Yeah, I'm planning to find out exactly how deep this goes." After Tommy left, Vince had called Ray Kowalski. The detective had agreed to meet that afternoon at Vince's office, away from the hospital and prying eyes. Ray had brought a file thick with photographs and documents, security footage from the Riverside Hotel showing Claire and Derek entering and leaving rooms, bank records revealing unusual patterns in Claire's spending, expensive clothes, jewelry, and dinners at restaurants Vince had never been to. Phone records revealed hundreds of calls and texts between Claire and Derek going back 8 months. But the most damning evidence was what Ray called the research trail. "Your wife has been busy," Ray explained, spreading documents across Vince's desk. She's contacted 3 different law firms about divorce proceedings, but never followed through. She's researched your life insurance policies through her position as beneficiary. She's even looked into the legal process for inheriting a business when the owner dies in an accident. Vince had studied the documents, feeling his anger crystallize into something colder and more focused. "She was planning to have me hurt," he said. "That's what it looks like. We think the crane cable didn't snap by accident. We're having it analyzed by metallurgy experts, but initial examination shows stress marks that look deliberate. Someone who knew how to make it look like equipment failure." The implications hit Vince like a physical blow. Derek wasn't just seeing his wife. He was an architect who understood structural engineering, who knew exactly how construction equipment worked, and who had access to the job site and knowledge of when Vince would be in the most dangerous positions. "We're building a case," Ray continued, "but it's going to take time. The evidence is mostly circumstantial right now. We need more." That's when Vince had made his decision. He would no longer wait for others to protect what he'd worked for. He would take matters into his own hands. "How much time do I have before you arrest them?" "Weeks, maybe months. We want to be absolutely certain before we move." "What?" Vince had looked around his office at the awards on the walls, the photographs of completed projects, the certificates of recognition from the community. All of it built on the belief that honest work and fair dealing would be rewarded. That trust was something sacred. That foundations, once properly laid, would support whatever you built on top of them. That man was gone. Now, the man sitting in this office understood that some foundations needed to be destroyed before you could build something new. "Because I want to handle this my way first." Ray had studied him carefully. "Vince, whatever you're thinking, be smart about it. Don't do anything that's going to ruin the case we're building." "I'm not going to ruin anything, but they tried to hurt me for money they haven't earned, and they think they're going to walk away from this." Vince had leaned back in his chair, his voice growing quiet and hard. "They have no idea what they've started." That evening, Vince had called Monica and asked her to come in early the next morning. Monica arrived at 7 a.m. sharp, her silver hair perfectly styled and her expression serious. She'd been with Morrison Construction for 8 years, and Vince trusted her judgment implicitly. "Monica, I need you to tell me everything about Claire's calls, everything you can remember." Monica had sat across from him, her hands folded in her lap, her voice precise as she recounted months of conversations that had seemed innocent at the time. Claire asking about Vince's schedule, about which sites required his personal supervision, about the safety protocols for high-rise work. "She seemed so concerned about your safety," Monica had said, "always asking if the sites were dangerous, if you'd be working near the crane operations. I thought it was sweet that she worried so much." But there was more. Claire had also asked about the business. Who would run it if something happened to Vince? Whether the company could survive without him? What would happen to the employees and ongoing projects? Questions that made perfect sense from a caring wife, but looked very different in the context of planned betrayal. "There's something else," Monica had added, her voice dropping. "Last week, she asked me about the Riverside project specifically. She wanted to know your exact schedule for the crane lifts, which days you'd be on the 20th floor. She said she was planning a surprise lunch for you." Vince had felt the last piece of the puzzle slide into place. Claire hadn't just known he would be in danger. She had known exactly when and where. "Monica, I need you to do something for me. Don't tell anyone about this conversation. Keep doing your job exactly the same way. But if Claire calls again, I want you to record every word she says." "Of course, Mr. Morrison. Is there anything else I can do?" Vince shook his head, appreciation in his tired eyes. "Just be careful, Monica, and thank you. I'll take it from here." He watched as Monica left, then returned to his desk and stared at the blueprints and evidence spread out before him. In that quiet moment, Vince realized that the demolition of a life built on trust could be as methodical and precise as the construction of a skyscraper, and he was ready to start laying the groundwork for what came next. Vince had looked at her, loyal, competent Monica, who had worked for him faithfully for 8 years, and realized he wasn't alone in this. He had people who valued loyalty, who understood the difference between right and wrong, who wouldn't be bought or swayed or turned against him. "Actually, yes. I want you to quietly reach out to our most trusted subcontractors, the ones we've worked with for years, the ones who've built their reputations with us. I may need some special work done soon. Off the books, paid in cash, no questions asked." Monica had smiled for the first time that morning, and Vince had seen something fierce in her eyes. "I understand completely, Mr. Morrison. It will be my pleasure." That night, as Vince sat in his home office surrounded by blueprints and evidence, he began to sketch out something entirely new. Not a building or a bridge or any of the honest structures that had made his reputation. This was a different kind of architecture, a careful, methodical plan designed to bring down everything Claire and Derek thought they had built. They had tried to destroy him, and they had failed. Now, they were about to learn what happened when you went to war with a man who built things to last, who never forgot a betrayal, and who understood that some foundations were meant to be demolished. The construction of Vincent Morrison's revenge was about to begin. Vincent Morrison had always believed that information was like concrete, useless until you mixed it properly and poured it into the right foundation. Over the next 3 weeks, he methodically gathered the materials he would need for the structure he was planning to build. A structure designed not to shelter, but to bury. The morning ritual had become as precise as any construction schedule. Vince would leave the house at his usual time, drive to his usual coffee shop, and review his usual project reports. To any observer, especially Claire or Derek, his routine appeared unchanged. The accident had slowed him down, but Vincent Morrison was back to business as usual, except that every movement was calculated, every conversation recorded, every meeting designed to gather intelligence. His first stop that Tuesday morning was the Riverside Hotel. Vince had arranged to meet with the manager, Robert Shunn, under the pretense of discussing lodging for out-of-town contractors on the Riverside project. But his real interest was in the security footage that Detective Kowalski couldn't access without a warrant. "Mr. Morrison, of course, we can accommodate your crews," Robert had said, leading Vince through the lobby. "We've housed many construction teams over the years." "I appreciate that, Robert, but I'm also concerned about security. My company has a reputation to maintain, and I need to know that our people and our business are protected here." Robert had nodded seriously. "Absolutely. Robert, I'm going to need copies of this footage for our security files," Vince had said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Of course, Mr. Morrison. I'll have my technician burn you a complete set." Next, Vince had driven to Millbrook Elementary School. He hadn't told Claire he was coming. Another test of the lies she'd been telling. The school secretary had been surprised to see him. "Mr. Morrison, how nice of you to visit. Are you here to pick up Claire?" "Actually, I was hoping to catch her during her planning period. Is she in her classroom?" The secretary had looked confused. "Oh, Claire's not here today. She called in for a personal day. Actually, she's used quite a few personal days recently. I was starting to worry she might be having health problems. Vince had kept his expression neutral. Probably just stress from the new curriculum. She mentioned some intensive training sessions. Training sessions? The secretary had frowned. We haven't had any curriculum training this year. Budget cuts. Another lie exposed. Every faculty meeting, every training session, every professional obligation Claire had claimed, all fictional covers for her afternoons with Derek. From the school, Vince had driven to Morrison Construction's office, where Monica had news that confirmed his darkest suspicions. "Mr. Morrison, I've been going through our project files like you asked," Monica had said, closing the office door behind them. Someone has been accessing confidential information without authorization. She'd spread out computer printouts showing access logs for their project management system. These are digital footprints showing when files were accessed and by whom. Look at these entries. The log showed that Derek Vaughn's access credentials, which should have been limited to architectural drawings and specifications, had been used to view financial reports, insurance documents, and personnel files. Information that no architect would need for legitimate project work. When did this start? 8 months ago. Right around the time Derek first visited the office to discuss the Riverside project, Monica confirmed, pulling out another set of documents. But here's what's really interesting. Some of these accesses happened after hours when Derek wasn't in the office. Someone else was using his credentials. Someone with physical access to his login information. Exactly. Someone he'd shared his passwords with, or someone who'd seen him enter them. Claire. She'd been to the office dozens of times over the past year, always stopping by Derek's temporary workspace when he was there for project meetings. She'd had opportunity to observe his computer access, to memorize passwords, to plan her intelligence gathering, just as carefully as she'd planned her secret encounters. "Monica, I need you to change all the security protocols immediately. New passwords for everyone, new access levels, and I want logs of every entry going forward." "Already done, Mr. Morrison. I also took the liberty of installing some additional monitoring software. If anyone tries to access files they shouldn't, we'll know immediately." That afternoon, Vince had met with Tommy Greco at a diner across town, away from the job sites where they might be observed. Tommy had brought along Joey Castellano, the crane operator who'd witnessed Vince's accident and called for help. Joey was a compact man in his 30s, with the quick reflexes and steady nerves that crane work required. He'd been operating heavy equipment for 12 years, and his assessment of the cable failure was definitive. "Mr. Morrison, that cable didn't snap from wear or overload," Joey said, his voice low and intense. "I examined it before the investigators took it away. The break pattern was wrong, too clean, too specific. Someone had scored the internal strands in exactly the right pattern to cause failure under stress." "You're sure?" "Positive. I've seen cables fail from fatigue, overweight, environmental damage. This was deliberate. Whoever did it knew exactly how to make it look accidental, while ensuring catastrophic failure." Tommy leaned forward. "Joey's got more, boss. The night before your accident, I was doing routine maintenance checks on all the equipment. Everything was perfect. I'd stake my reputation on it. But that morning, about an hour before the accident, someone had been in the crane cab. The seat was adjusted different. There were coffee cup rings on the console, and the positioning was slightly off." Vince had felt his blood chill. Someone sabotaged the crane that morning. "That's what I think," Joey confirmed. "Someone with enough technical knowledge to access the cable mechanism without triggering obvious damage." Someone who knew you'd be in position for the lift at exactly 2:47 p.m. The pieces were falling into place with the precision of a demolition sequence. Derek had architectural training that included structural engineering. He'd had access to the job site and knowledge of Vince's schedule. And he'd had inside information from Claire about exactly when Vince would be in the most vulnerable position. But Joey had one more revelation. "Mr. Morrison, I've been thinking about this nonstop since the accident. The only way someone could have timed this so precisely is if they had real-time information about your location. I think someone was watching the site that day, waiting for the exact moment to trigger the failure." "Watching from where?" "The Riverside Hotel has a clear view of the 20th floor, room 237 specifically. I checked the angles myself." Room 237. The same room where Claire and Derek had been meeting. The same room with the perfect vantage point to watch Vince die. That evening, as Vince sat in his office reviewing the intelligence he'd gathered, his phone rang. Claire's voice was bright and cheerful, the performance of a loving wife calling to check on her recovering husband. "Hi, honey. How are you feeling today? You've been working so hard since the accident." "I'm fine, Claire. Just trying to catch up on everything that fell behind while I was in the hospital." "That's wonderful. I'm so proud of how you're bouncing back." A pause. "Oh, I forgot to mention I have another faculty meeting tonight. New state requirements for standardized testing. It might run late." Another lie. Vince had already confirmed with the school that no meetings were scheduled. He knew exactly where Claire would be spending her evening and with whom. "Of course, sweetheart. Don't worry about dinner. I'll grab something at the office. You're so understanding. I love you so much, Vince." "I love you too, Claire." But as Vince hung up the phone, he realized that the man who had loved Claire Morrison was as dead as if the steel beam had crushed him completely. What remained was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. Someone who now had all the information he needed to begin construction on the most important project of his life. Not a building that would stand for decades, but a reckoning that would be remembered forever. Claire and Derek thought they had committed the perfect crime. They were about to discover that Vincent Morrison didn't just build structures, he built consequences. The abandoned warehouse on the south side of town had been one of Morrison Construction's first major renovation projects 15 years ago. Vince had transformed it from a crumbling relic into a modern distribution center. But the company had outgrown the space and moved on. Now it served a different purpose. A place where conversations could happen without witnesses and plans could be made without oversight. Vince stood in the center of the cavernous space, surrounded by 5 men who had built their reputations alongside Morrison Construction. These weren't ordinary contractors. They were specialists, each with skills that extended far beyond conventional building trades. "Gentlemen," Vince began, his voice echoing in the empty space. "You're here because over the years, you've proven something that's become rare in business today. Loyalty. When I've needed you, you've delivered. When you've needed work, I've provided it. We've built something together that goes deeper than contracts and paychecks." The men nodded. They understood the code of their world. Loyalty earned through shared risk. Trust built through keeping promises. Bonds forged in the honest sweat of difficult work. Tony, the Bull Marone, stepped forward first. Tony was a demolition specialist whose Italian family had been bringing down buildings for 3 generations. He was built like his nickname suggested, thick, powerful, and unstoppable when he set his mind to something. More importantly, Tony had connections in places where questions weren't asked and problems could disappear. "Vince, whatever you need, You got it. After what happened to you, what they tried to do. Tony's scarred hands clenched into fists. That ain't just business. That's personal. Next was Carl Ghost Williams, an electrician whose nickname came from his ability to move through buildings without leaving traces. Carl was thin and quiet, with the kind of technical knowledge that could make security systems fail, or communications mysteriously disappear. He'd learned his skills in the military before finding his way into construction, and some of those military skills had never left him. Been waiting for you to call this meeting, Carl said softly. Figured you weren't the type to let something like this slide. Luis Mendez had started as a concrete finisher, but had developed into something more. A master of making things look exactly as they should, while hiding what they actually were. Luis could create false walls, hidden compartments, and structural modifications that would fool any inspector. His work was art, and his art sometimes served purposes that regular contractors didn't discuss. My family understands betrayal, Luis said, his accent thick with controlled anger. We take care of our own. The fourth man was Frank Numbers Kowalski, Detective Ray's younger brother, though neither spoke of their family connection in professional settings. Frank had left the police force after 10 years to become a private security consultant, specializing in investigation and surveillance. His contacts in law enforcement were invaluable, and his understanding of evidence and procedure made him careful in ways that kept everyone safe. Ray told me what they did to you, Frank said. Tell me what the evidence shows. This isn't justice. This is war. Finally, there was Marcus Doc Reynolds, whose medical training as a combat medic had evolved into something more comprehensive over the years. Doc could treat injuries without hospitals, acquire materials without prescriptions, and ensure that certain activities left no lasting traces. He was the kind of man you hoped never to need, but who you were grateful to know if the need arose. They tried to kill you, Vince. That crosses every line there is. Whatever you're planning, I'm in. Vince looked at each man in turn, seeing not just their willingness, but their understanding. This wasn't about money or revenge. It was about the fundamental code that held their world together. When someone broke that code, when they violated the trust that made their community possible, consequences had to follow. Here's what I know, Vince began, and spent the next hour laying out everything he'd discovered. The affair, the planned murder, the insurance money, the systematic betrayal that had been growing for 8 months. He showed them the evidence: photographs, documents, security footage, financial records. When he finished, the warehouse was silent, except for the sound of 5 men processing the magnitude of what they'd heard. Tony spoke first. So, they're going to walk away rich after trying to murder you. That what you're telling us? That's what would happen if we left it to the legal system? But we're not going to do that, Vince replied. What do you need? Carl asked simply. Vince pulled out architectural drawings, not building plans, but something else entirely, a methodical, step-by-step blueprint for dismantling 2 lives with the same precision that his crew brought to their construction projects. I need surveillance on both of them 24/7. I need to know where they go, who they talk to, what they do when they think no one's watching. I need access to their homes, their cars, their communications. I need their financial records, their daily routines, their weaknesses, and pressure points. Frank nodded. That's doable. How long do we have? The police are building their case, but Detective Kowalski thinks it'll be months before they have enough for arrests. That gives us time to do this, right? And when we have all that information, Luis asked, what then? Vince's smile was cold and hard. Then we're going to teach them what happens when you try to destroy something that took 20 years to build. We're going to show them what real planning looks like, what genuine patience accomplishes, and what happens when people who actually know how to tear things down decide to go to work. Doc leaned forward. What's the timeline? Phase 1 starts immediately. Surveillance, intelligence gathering, establishing access. I want to know everything about their lives, their fears, their ambitions, their secrets. Everyone has pressure points. We're going to find theirs. And phase 2? Tony asked. Psychological pressure. We start making their lives complicated. Nothing illegal, nothing traceable, just a series of problems that seem like bad luck, but keep mounting up. Make them paranoid, make them doubt each other, make them wonder if someone knows something. In phase 3, Carl's voice was barely a whisper. We strike. Vince looked around the warehouse at the concrete he'd poured, the steel he'd raised, the projects he'd completed with his own hands, and the sweat of honest work. In phase 3, we bring it all down. Then he thought about Claire's performance at the hospital, about Derek's calculated sabotage of the crane, about the hotel room where they'd planned his death. Phase 3 is when they learned that Vincent Morrison doesn't forgive ever. They tried to take everything from me, my life, my business, my trust in the world. They're going to discover what it feels like to lose everything that matters to them, one piece at a time, until there's nothing left but the knowledge that they brought it on themselves. The men were quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. This wasn't a simple beating or a quick revenge. This was something methodical and comprehensive, designed to destroy not just lives, but the very foundations those lives were built on. One more thing, Vince added. When this is over, they'll know it was me. They'll know exactly why it happened and who did it to them. But they'll never be able to prove it, and they'll never be able to stop it. Tony grinned, the expression transforming his brutal features. Boss, this is going to be the most beautiful demolition job ever done. As the men dispersed into the night, each with specific assignments and encrypted communication protocols, Vince remained in the warehouse. He stood in the center of the space he'd built 15 years ago, surrounded by the echoes of honest work and legitimate accomplishment. Tomorrow, that honest work would take a different direction. He was still building something, but what he was constructing now was justice of a kind that no court could deliver and no law could recognize. Claire and Derek had taught him that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. Now he was going to teach them that some foundations, once destroyed, could never be rebuilt. 3 weeks into the surveillance operation, Vince sat in his home office reviewing reports that painted a picture more sordid than even he had imagined. The information his crew had gathered revealed that Claire and Derek's betrayal was not just deeper than he'd known. It was more methodical and more cruel. Frank's surveillance reports arrived every morning in encrypted files that detailed every movement, every conversation, every private moment in the lives of his wife and her lover. The technology of modern surveillance had evolved far beyond anything the police used routinely, and Frank's military-grade equipment captured everything. They're not just planning to get rid of you, Frank had explained during their morning briefing at the warehouse. They're already spending the insurance money. The photographs Frank spread across the table showed Claire and Derek at luxury car dealerships, real estate offices, and high-end jewelry stores. They were shopping for their new life together with the casual confidence of people who believed their victim was too trusting to discover their plans and too weak to stop them. But the audio surveillance revealed something worse. Carl's work on their communications had yielded hours of recorded conversations that stripped away any possibility that this was a crime of passion or circumstance. "Listen to this," Carl said, connecting his laptop to portable speakers. Derek's voice filled the warehouse, clear and callous. "The beauty of the construction accident approach is that nobody questions equipment failure. Cables break all the time in that business. Even if they investigate, they'll find stressed metal and assume it was wear and tear." Claire's laughter was like broken glass. "And I'll be the grieving widow who's too devastated to answer a lot of questions, at least for the first few months while the insurance companies process everything. By the time anyone thinks to dig deeper, we'll be in Costa Rica with new identities and enough money to live like royalty. Vincent's 20 years of work pays for our retirement." The recording continued for another 10 minutes, laying out details of their escape plan, their financial arrangements, and their complete lack of remorse for destroying an innocent man's life. They talked about Vince like he was an obstacle to be removed, not a human being who had loved and trusted them. Luis had accessed their homes while they were at work, installing hidden cameras and microphones that revealed the intimate details of their planning. The footage showed them using Vince's own home office to plan his murder, sitting at his desk while calculating insurance payouts and discussing which of his belongings they would sell and which they would keep as trophies. "They've been at this for over a year," Luis reported, his voice tight with disgust. "I found journals, printed emails going back 14 months. This wasn't impulse. This was their long-term plan from almost the beginning of their affair." Tony's connections had provided a different kind of intelligence. The demolition business overlapped with salvage operations, insurance investigations, and the kinds of people who knew how to make problems disappear or appear, depending on what was needed. "Here's what really makes me sick," Tony said, holding up a thick folder. "They didn't just plan to kill you. They planned to make it look like suicide if the accident didn't work." The folder contained evidence that Claire had been quietly establishing a narrative of Vince's supposed depression and instability. She'd mentioned to coworkers and friends that he'd been under stress and working too hard. She'd researched depression symptoms and suicide methods. She'd even started making vague comments about their marriage having difficulties that she was trying to work through. If the crane accident had failed, she was going to poison you and make it look like you killed yourself out of business stress and marital problems, Tony continued. She already bought the chemicals. Doc found them hidden in the garage. Doc's medical expertise had revealed the most chilling aspect of their plan. Digitalis, derived from foxglove plants, causes heart failure that looks natural unless you're specifically testing for it. She had enough to kill 3 men your size, and she'd researched the exact dosage needed to avoid detection in a routine autopsy. The methodical nature of their planning was stunning. They hadn't just decided to commit murder. They had crafted multiple scenarios, backup plans, and detailed strategies for avoiding detection. They had spent months preparing to not just take Vince's life, but to completely erase his memory and steal his legacy. "There's more," Frank said, pulling out another set of documents. "They've been systematically isolating you from your support network. Claire has been telling people that you've been difficult to live with, that the business stress has been making you unpredictable. She's laying groundwork so that when you're gone, people will remember her as the long-suffering wife who tried to help her troubled husband." Vince studied the evidence spread across the table. Photographs, recordings, financial documents, chemical analysis reports. The scope of the betrayal was breathtaking. This wasn't just adultery or even simple murder. This was the complete annihilation of everything he had built, everything he represented, everything he was. "What's our next move?" Marcus asked. Vince looked around at his crew. 5 men who had risked their reputations and possibly their freedom to help him uncover the truth. Men who understood that some violations demanded consequences that the legal system couldn't provide. Now we start showing them what real planning looks like, Vince said. They think they're smart because they've been able to fool one trusting man. They're about to discover what happens when they go up against people who actually know how to destroy lives. He pulled out his own set of plans, detailed, methodical blueprints for psychological warfare that would make Claire and Derek's schemes look like children's games. Phase 2 starts tomorrow. We're going to introduce uncertainty into their lives. Small problems at first, the kind of things that could be coincidences, but they'll escalate and they'll pile up, and eventually, Claire and Derek will start to realize that someone knows exactly what they've been doing. How do we start? Carl asked. With their confidence, right now. They think they're in control. They think they've planned for everything, and that Vince Morrison is too stupid to threaten them. We're going to show them how wrong they are, one perfectly executed problem at a time. Vince spread out the first phase of his counterplan. It was elegant in its simplicity, a series of seemingly unrelated incidents that would slowly destroy the foundation of security that Claire and Derek had built their future on. The beauty of this approach, Vince explained, is that each individual incident will seem explainable. Bad luck, bureaucratic mix-ups, coincidence, but taken together, they'll create a pattern of pressure that will make them paranoid and desperate. And when they're paranoid and desperate, Tony asked with a grin, that's when people make mistakes. And when Claire and Derek make mistakes, we'll be there to document every one of them. By the time we're finished, they'll have provided us with all the evidence we need to destroy them completely. As the meeting ended, and the men prepared to implement their assignments, Vince remained in the warehouse, staring at the architectural drawings of his revenge. For 20 years, he had built structures designed to last, to shelter, to serve the community. Now, he was building something different, a systematic demolition of 2 lives that had forfeited their right to the trust and protection that society provided. Claire and Derek had declared war on everything Vincent Morrison represented. They were about to discover that Vincent Morrison was very, very good at war. The first cracks began to appear in Claire and Derek's perfect world on a Tuesday morning in late October. Claire's credit cards were declined at 3 different stores within 2 hours. Not because of insufficient funds, but due to security flags that required verification of recent purchases in foreign countries she'd never visited. Derek received notice that his professional licensing was under review by the state board due to anonymous complaints about his work on the Riverside project. Separately, each incident was frustrating, but explainable. Together, they marked the beginning of Vincent Morrison's masterpiece of systematic destruction. The key, Vince explained to his crew during their weekly briefing, is precision. Each problem has to be just serious enough to cause real stress, but not so obvious that they immediately suspect deliberate sabotage. Frank's surveillance reports showed that the initial pressure was working exactly as planned. Claire and Derek's recorded conversations revealed growing anxiety and suspicion, not of Vince, but of each other. Maybe you made a mistake with the credit card information. Derek's voice crackled through the speakers. Maybe you used it somewhere you shouldn't have. Claire's reply was sharp with stress. This has to be some kind of system error, or maybe the bank is cracking down on unusual spending patterns. But the problems continued to escalate. Derek's architectural firm received notice that several of his past projects were being investigated for code violations. Claire discovered that someone had reported her to the state education department for excessive absences from her teaching position. Their hotel of choice, the Riverside, suddenly required additional identification and credit verification for all guests. "They're starting to crack," Doc observed, reviewing the psychological profiles he developed on both targets. Derek is naturally paranoid anyway. Comes from growing up in a family where everyone was trying to scam everyone else. Claire's control issues mean she can't handle uncertainty. The beauty of Vince's plan was that each problem was real and legitimate. Tony's connections had ensured all the credit card flags were triggered by actual security concerns. Purchases made with cloned card numbers in countries notorious for identity theft. The licensing complaints came from real contractors who had genuine concerns about Derek's work quality. The education department reports were filed by anonymous sources who had documented evidence of Claire's violations. "We're not framing them," Vince clarified during one strategy session. "We're just making sure that their actual violations get the attention they deserve." 2 weeks into Phase 2, Carl intercepted a phone call that revealed how deeply the pressure was affecting their relationship. "This is your fault." Claire's voice was brittle with accusation. "Your sloppy work, your corner cutting. Now it's all coming back to haunt us right when we need to stay invisible." "My fault?" Derek's response was venomous. "You're the one who's been playing grieving wife while running around town spending money like a lottery winner. Of course people are going to notice. I've been careful." "Careful? You bought a $15,000 necklace last week. You think that doesn't show up on financial records? You think insurance investigators don't look at that kind of spending?" The conversation degraded into accusations and recriminations, revealing just how shallow their bond actually was, without the shared goal of getting rid of Vince to unite them. Claire and Derek had little foundation for their relationship beyond desire and greed. But Vince wasn't finished applying pressure. Luis had been busy in both their homes, making subtle modifications that created ongoing problems. Claire's house developed mysterious electrical issues that required expensive repairs. Derek's apartment building received notice of pest control problems that forced fumigation and temporary relocation. The psychological warfare intensified when Frank arranged for both of them to receive anonymous packages containing photocopies of their hotel registration records. No threats, no demands, just evidence that someone knew about their affair and was documenting their activities. "That's when they'll start to understand," Vince explained to his crew. "Right now, they think their problems are random bad luck. But when they realize someone is watching them, someone who knows their secrets, they'll start to panic." The panic manifested exactly as Vince had predicted. Claire and Derek's conversations became increasingly paranoid and desperate. They started meeting in different locations, using cash instead of credit cards, and generally behaving like the criminals they actually were. "We need to accelerate the timeline," Derek said during a conversation Carl recorded from their new meeting spot, a diner 40 miles outside town. "Someone knows something, and we can't wait for the police investigation to fade away." "What are you saying?" Claire asked. "I'm saying maybe it's time for Plan B. Maybe Vincent has another accident. Something that can't be traced back to equipment failure." Claire's response chilled even Vince's hardened crew. "You mean murder him directly?" "I mean, finish what we started. We've come too far to back down now." That conversation changed everything. What had been psychological warfare now became a race against time. Claire and Derek weren't just guilty of attempted murder. They were actively planning to try again. Vince called an emergency meeting for that evening. His crew gathered in the warehouse, their faces grim as they listened to the recorded conversation. "They're going to try again," Frank said unnecessarily. "And this time, they won't try to make it look accidental." "How long do we have?" Tony asked. Based on their conversation, maybe 2 weeks. They're planning something for the anniversary of their first attempt, some kind of poetic justice in their minds. Vince stood and walked to the center of the warehouse, his mind racing through calculations and possibilities. For weeks, he had been the architect of a careful, methodical campaign of psychological pressure. Now, he had to become something else, a general preparing for a battle where the stakes were life and death. "We move to phase 3 immediately," he announced. "No more gradual pressure, no more subtle problems. They've declared their intention to commit murder, and that changes the rules completely." "What do you need?" Marcus asked. Vince turned to face his crew. 5 men who had committed themselves to his cause, who understood that some betrayals demanded consequences beyond what the law could provide. "I need them to understand exactly who they've been trying to destroy. I need them to realize that Vincent Morrison isn't the weak, trusting fool they thought they were manipulating. And I need them to face the consequences of their choices in a way they'll never forget." He pulled out the final set of plans, blueprints for a confrontation that would settle the accounts between them once and for all. The preliminary campaign had been about pressure and psychology. What came next would be about justice and retribution. "They want to play with people's lives," Vince said, his voice carrying the weight of 20 years of honest work and absolute betrayal. "They're about to learn what happens when they try that game with someone who actually knows how to win." The men studied the plans, seeing in them the culmination of everything they had worked toward. This wasn't just revenge. It was the restoration of order to a world where trust meant something and betrayal carried a price. "When do we start?" Carl asked. Vince looked around the warehouse one more time, thinking about the man he had been before the accident and the man he had become since. The transformation was complete now. Vincent Morrison, the trusting husband, was gone. What remained was someone harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous. "Tomorrow," he said. "Tomorrow, Claire and Derek learn what real planning looks like." The Riverside Hotel had been the stage for Claire and Derek's deception for over a year. It seemed fitting that it would also be the setting for their education and consequences. Vince stood in room 238, directly across the hall from their usual meeting place, reviewing the final details of an operation that would end their threat permanently, while ensuring that justice was served in a way the legal system could never achieve. The room had been rented under one of Frank's carefully maintained false identities, paid for in cash, with occupancy records that would disappear into the bureaucratic maze of hotel administration. Carl had spent 3 days wiring the space with surveillance equipment and communication systems that would allow Vince's crew to monitor and coordinate every aspect of what was about to unfold. "They'll be here in 2 hours," Frank reported, checking his encrypted phone. "Same routine as always. Derek arrives first. Claire follows 15 minutes later. They think they're planning Vincent Morrison's funeral. Instead, they're walking into their own reckoning." The confrontation had been months in the making, requiring careful orchestration of events that would bring Claire and Derek to exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, with exactly the right mindset. They needed to be desperate enough to take risks, confident enough to believe they still controlled the situation, and isolated enough that their choices would have consequences no one could prevent. Vince had spent the previous week creating the perfect storm of pressure. Derek's architectural firm had received notice that his professional insurance was being canceled due to risk assessment concerns. Claire had been informed that her teaching position was under review for violating attendance policies. Both had received anonymous deliveries of photographs showing them together in compromising situations. The psychological campaign had achieved its goal. Claire and Derek were panicked, paranoid, and convinced that someone was closing in on their secret. Their recorded conversations showed two people desperate enough to do anything to protect themselves and their plans. "We have to eliminate the threat," Derek had said during their most recent meeting. "Vincent knows something, or someone who works for him knows something. Either way, he's too dangerous to leave alive." That conversation had taken place 48 hours ago. Since then, Vince's crew had been implementing the final phase of his plan. "Tony, are you in position?" "Ready, boss. All exits are covered, and we have complete privacy. Hotel security has been temporarily redirected." Tony's connections had ensured that the Riverside Hotel's normal security protocols would experience convenient technical difficulties during the crucial time frame. Camera systems would malfunction, electronic locks would fail to record access attempts, and the skeleton crew working the evening shift would be dealing with emergencies in other parts of the building. "Luis, status report?" "Construction is complete. Room 237 has been modified according to specifications. They'll have exactly the privacy they think they want." Luis had spent 2 days making subtle alterations to the hotel room where Claire and Derek had planned Vince's murder. The changes were invisible to casual inspection, but would become very significant when the confrontation began. "Carl, communications? All channels are clear. We have complete monitoring capability and full control over electronic systems in the target area. Doc, medical standing by with everything we might need. Though based on the plan, I don't think we'll be providing aid to the opposition." Marcus's voice carried dark humor, but his preparation was absolutely serious. What was about to happen would require careful management of evidence, witnesses, and consequences. "Frank, final surveillance check?" Derek arrived 10 minutes ago. Claire's car just pulled into the parking lot. Everything is proceeding exactly as predicted. Vince took a deep breath, feeling the weight of months of planning and 20 years of betrayed trust settling onto his shoulders. In a few minutes, he would face the two people who had tried to destroy everything he had built. He would look into the eyes of the woman he had loved and trusted, and the man who had pretended to be his professional partner while plotting his death. "Gentlemen," Vince said into his headset, "it's time to show Claire and Derek what real planning looks like." He walked across the hallway and used the electronic keycard Carl had provided to enter room 237. The space looked exactly as it had for months, a standard hotel room where two people had met to plan the murder of an innocent man. But now, it would serve a different purpose. Derek was standing by the window, his expensive suit unable to hide the stress that had been eating at him for weeks. He turned as Vince entered, his face cycling through confusion, recognition, and terror in the space of 3 seconds. "Hello, Derek," Vince said calmly, closing the door behind him. "I think it's time we had a conversation about construction, safety, and professional ethics." Derek opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. The man who had been so confident in his plans to commit murder found himself face to face with his intended victim in a situation he had never anticipated and couldn't control. "Oh, don't worry," Vince continued, walking further into the room. "Claire will be here soon. I wouldn't want her to miss this reunion. After all, she's been such an important part of your project planning." Derek finally found his voice. "Vincent, I don't know what you think you know, but I know everything, Derek. Every detail, every conversation, every plan. I know about the crane sabotage, the insurance money, the backup plan with the digitalis. I know about the fake depression narrative and the suicide scenario. I know about your escape route to Costa Rica and your plans to live off my life's work." The color drained from Derek's face. "You can't prove any of that." Vince smiled, the expression carrying no warmth whatsoever. Derek, I don't need to prove anything. I'm not here as a plaintiff in a lawsuit or a witness in a criminal trial. I'm here as Vincent Morrison, the man you tried to murder for money you didn't earn. A soft knock at the door interrupted the conversation. Claire's voice called out, "Derek, it's me." "Come in, sweetheart," Vince called back. "We're having a fascinating discussion about architecture and planning." The door opened, and Claire stepped into the room, her face bright with the anticipation of lovers meeting for a secret rendezvous. The expression died when she saw Vince standing in the center of the room, calm and confident, and very much alive. "Hello, Claire," Vince said. "I thought it was time the three of us had an honest conversation about our future together." Claire's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. The performance skills that had served her so well when playing the grieving wife abandoned her completely when faced with the reality of discovery. "Vincent, what are you doing here? How did I know about your afternoon meetings? How did I know about your plans to kill me and steal my life's work? How did I know about the crane sabotage and the backup murder plot?" Vince reached into his jacket and pulled out a tablet computer. With a few touches, he activated a video file that began playing on the screen. Claire and Derek's own voices filled the room, recorded during their planning sessions, where they had discussed the details of his murder with casual cruelty. "I know everything because I've been watching and listening for months," Vince continued. "Every conversation, every meeting, every moment you thought you were safe and unobserved. I have documentation of every crime you've planned, every betrayal you've committed, every moment you've spent preparing to destroy an innocent man." Derek stepped toward the door, but Vince's voice stopped him. "I wouldn't try to leave, Derek. The hotel is experiencing some technical difficulties tonight, and I'm afraid the electronic locks are malfunctioning. You'll find that the door won't open without the right authorization." Derek tried the handle anyway. The door remained firmly locked. "Sit down," Vince commanded, his voice carrying the authority of a man who had spent 20 years managing construction crews in dangerous situations. "Both of you, we have business to discuss." Claire and Derek reluctantly took seats on the edge of the bed, their faces pale with the realization that their perfect plan had somehow become their worst nightmare. "Now," Vince said, setting the tablet on the dresser where they could both see it clearly, "let's talk about consequences." The silence in the hotel room stretched for 30 seconds while Claire and Derek processed the magnitude of their situation. They had expected to be planning Vincent Morrison's death. Instead, they found themselves facing a man who had systematically dismantled their lives while they believed themselves to be in control. "You're wondering how this happened," Vince said, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had built his revenge as carefully as he built skyscrapers. "You're wondering how the trusting fool you thought you were manipulating managed to outmaneuver the two brilliant schemers who had planned the perfect murder." Derek found his voice first. "Vincent, whatever you think you know, I think I know that you scored the crane cable to create a catastrophic failure that would kill me while making it look like an equipment accident. I think I know that you positioned yourself in this hotel room to watch me die, and that you were disappointed when I survived." Vince activated another file on the tablet. Security footage from the construction site played on the screen, showing Derek accessing the crane equipment in the early morning hours before the accident. "I think I know that when the murder attempt failed, you and my wife decided to accelerate your timeline and try a more direct approach." Another file opened, playing the recorded conversation where they discussed eliminating him as a threat. Claire finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. How long have you known?" "I've suspected for months. I've known for certain since Detective Kowalski showed me the evidence. But I've been planning this confrontation since the day I realized my wife was more disappointed than relieved when I survived your murder attempt." Vince walked to the window and looked out at the construction site where they had tried to kill him. The building was nearly complete now, rising into the night sky as a testament to honest work and legitimate achievement. "You made a fundamental error in your planning," he continued. "You assumed that Vincent Morrison was weak because he was trusting. You assumed that a man who believed in honor and loyalty would be helpless when faced with betrayal. You never considered what would happen when that trust was shattered and that loyalty was redirected." He turned back to face them. "Now, you're going to learn the consequences of that mistake. You're going to understand what happens when you try to destroy someone who knows how to build and how to tear down. You're going to experience firsthand the kind of planning and precision that you thought you could use against me." Vince's voice grew colder, harder. "And when we're finished, you'll know exactly who you tried to betray and what it means to face the man you thought you could control. You'll understand that Vincent Morrison doesn't forgive, and he doesn't forget. You'll learn that some foundations, once destroyed, can never be rebuilt. And you'll discover that the man you tried to kill is the one person you should have feared the most." He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. "This is your reckoning. This is your final demolition. And this is the end of everything you thought you had planned." And both Claire and Derek recoiled from the cold purpose in his eyes. "For months, you've been living in a world where every problem could be explained as coincidence, where every complication could be rationalized as bad luck. But deep down, you've both started to suspect that someone was watching, someone who knew your secrets." Derek started to stand, but Vince's voice cut through the air like a whip. "Don't move." The architect froze, recognizing something in Vince's tone that warned against testing his patience further. "You want to know what real planning looks like? You want to understand what happens when someone with actual intelligence and resources decides to destroy your life?" Vince reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick folder. "Let me show you." He opened the folder and began laying documents on the dresser. Financial records showing every purchase they had made with stolen money. Photographs documenting their affair. Phone records proving their conspiracy. Medical evidence of the digitalis Claire had hidden for her backup murder plan. "But this is just the evidence of your crimes," Vince continued. "The real planning went much deeper." He pulled out another set of documents. "Derek, your architectural license has been permanently revoked. The state board received evidence of your involvement in construction fraud, code violations, and conspiracy to commit murder. You'll never work in this field again." Derek's face went white. His professional identity, his entire career, had just been destroyed with bureaucratic precision. "Claire, your teaching certification has been suspended pending investigation. The state education department has received evidence of your attendance violations, your academic dishonesty, and your involvement in criminal conspiracy. Your career in education is over." Claire began to sob, but Vince wasn't finished. "But destroying your careers was just the beginning. I've also ensured that your financial futures are appropriately limited. Derek, your bank accounts have been frozen pending investigation of suspected money laundering. Claire, your access to our joint accounts has been terminated, and divorce proceedings have been initiated that will leave you with exactly what you brought to our marriage. Nothing." The documents kept coming. Criminal referrals to the district attorney's office. Civil lawsuits for fraud and conspiracy. insurance investigations that would pursue both of them for attempted murder for financial gain. "You thought you were planning to steal my life and live happily ever after," Vince said. "Instead, you've destroyed your own lives so completely that you'll spend the next 20 years in legal proceedings, bankruptcy, and very likely prison." Derek finally found the courage to speak. "You can't prove we tried to kill you." Vince smiled, and the expression was terrifying in its complete lack of humanity. "Derek, I don't need to prove anything in a court of law. I've already destroyed everything that mattered to you. Your career, your finances, your freedom, your future. But you're right that the legal system has limitations." He walked back to the window and gestured toward the construction site. "That building out there will stand for 100 years. It's built on a foundation that will never shift, never crack, never fail. It represents honest work, legitimate achievement, and the kind of legacy that lasts." He turned back to face them. "You tried to build your future on my death. You tried to create happiness through murder and theft. But foundations built on evil don't last, Derek. They crumble under their own weight." Vince reached into his jacket one final time and pulled out a small device that looked like a garage door opener. "This hotel room has been modified with several improvements that Luis installed while you thought you were safe and unobserved. Hidden cameras have been recording everything that's happened here tonight. But more importantly, the structural supports for this room have been adjusted." Derek and Claire looked around the room with growing horror, finally understanding that they had walked into something much more dangerous than a confrontation. "Vincent, you can't," Claire began. "I can't what? I can't seek justice for attempted murder. I can't protect myself from people who have already tried to kill me once and were planning to try again." Vince pressed a button on the device. Deep within the walls of the hotel room, Luis's carefully placed charges activated with precise timing. The floor beneath Claire and Derek began to shift and crack. "The beauty of controlled demolition," Vince explained calmly, "is that it requires exact knowledge of structural engineering, precise timing, and complete understanding of how foundations fail." The room tilted as support beams that had been scored and weakened gave way according to Luis's careful calculations. Claire and Derek screamed as they realized they were falling with the debris of the collapsing floor. Vince stepped back toward the door, which Carl had programmed to unlock automatically when the demolition sequence began. As he reached safety, he turned for one final look at the two people who had tried to destroy his life. "You wanted to know what happens when you try to tear down something that took 20 years to build. This is what real planning looks like." The floor gave way completely, dropping Claire and Derek 40 feet into the hotel's basement mechanical room, where Tony's crew was waiting with equipment that would ensure their bodies were never found in a condition that would provide useful evidence. As Vince walked out of the Riverside Hotel for the last time, his encrypted phone buzzed with a message from Frank. "Evidence destruction complete. All records sanitized. Legal proceedings will continue as scheduled." The next morning, newspapers would report that Derek Vaughn and Claire Morrison had disappeared under mysterious circumstances while under investigation for attempted murder and fraud. Their rental car would be found abandoned near the Canadian border, suggesting they had fled the country to avoid prosecution. Vincent Morrison would inherit their abandoned estates through legal proceedings that documented their crimes while providing no trace of his involvement in their disappearance. He would use that money to establish a foundation for construction safety, ensuring that what had happened to him would never happen to other innocent workers. 6 months later, Vince stood on the observation deck of the completed Riverside building, looking out over the city he had helped shape through 20 years of honest work. The building beneath his feet was solid, permanent, built to last centuries. Detective Ray Kowalski joined him, sipping coffee as they watched the sunrise illuminate the skyline. "Any word on the missing persons case?" Vince asked. Ray shook his head. "Claire and Derek Vaughn seem to have vanished completely. The investigation is officially ongoing, but between you and me, I think they're probably living under new identities somewhere in South America." "Probably best for everyone involved," Vince replied. "Some people aren't meant for honest work." As they stood together in comfortable silence, both men understood that justice had been served in a way that no court could have achieved. The legal system had limitations. Human retribution did not. Vincent Morrison had learned that trust was a luxury he could no longer afford. But he had also learned that when you built something properly, whether it was a skyscraper or a plan for justice, it would stand forever. The foundation was solid. Everything built on top of it would last.